It is a little after 1 in the morning on the 6th of June, 1944, and the sky over Normandy is full of men falling out of it. The anti-aircraft fire has scattered the transport planes, and the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne are coming down in the dark miles from where they should be, alone, in flooded fields and hedgerows, some of them already dead before they hit the ground. Among the men drifting down into that chaos are 2 lieutenants who could not be less alike. One is a quiet, sober, self-controlled man from the Pennsylvania farm country who is about to prove himself one of the finest combat leaders the United States Army will produce in the entire war. The other is a rich, brilliant, hard-drinking Yale man who will spend the next 50 years slowly falling apart. They will land in the same nightmare and fight the same war, and the thing that matters most about them is not the battles they are about to win. It is what these 2 opposite men are about to become to each other. If true, human stories of the men behind the famous names are what you came for, take a second and subscribe. Now, back to Normandy, and to a friendship that would outlast the war by half a century. One thing has to be said first. These men were real. Richard Winters, called Dick, and Lewis Nixon, called Nix, were real officers of Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and their story is documented in the Army's records, in the historian Stephen Ambrose's work, and in Winters's own memoir. A famous television series later made their faces known around the world, but this is not that. This is the history underneath it, drawn from the record and from the men's own words. What is described here, the cold, the dark, the weight of a thing carried for years, is drawn from how they themselves remembered it. The men were real, the friendship was real. This is as close to it as the record allows. They belonged to the Airborne, a new and half-mad idea that you could take your best young men, teach them to jump out of airplanes behind enemy lines, and drop them into the middle of the enemy. To fight, attract a certain kind of man, proud, tough, a little reckless. It attracted a certain Normandy. Easy Company was full of them, and leading them by the time they jumped into Normandy was Dick Winters, who was none of those things on the surface, and who turned out to be exactly the man they needed. Winters came from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, from a quiet, plain, hard-working world, and he carried it with him. He did not drink. He did not curse much. He did not chase the things the other young officers chased. He led by example and by a kind of visible decency that men found they wanted to live up to. He was not loud. He never needed to be. In a company full of hard cases, the toughest men in the outfit came to trust the sober farm boy completely. Because he was calm when everything came apart, because he went first, and because he plainly, genuinely cared whether they lived. He was the rarest thing in a war, a leader his men would follow anywhere, and a decent man at the same time. Lewis Nixon was his opposite in almost every way. He came from money, real money, an old industrial family, and he had gone to Yale, and he was quick and funny and cynical, and one of the smartest officers in the battalion. He was also already drinking too, and he would drink more as the war went on. He was not a natural frontline leader the way Winters was. He served as the battalion's intelligence officer, the man who read the maps and the enemy, and he was very good at it. On paper, the disciplined teetotaler and the witty, wealthy drinker had nothing in common and no reason to be close. In practice, they became the closest friends either of them would ever have. No one who wrote about them could ever fully explain it, and maybe that is the truth of most real friendships. Winters saw something in Nixon worth standing by, past the drinking and the cynicism, a loyalty and a brilliance and a wounded decency. Nixon saw in Winters the thing he could not manage in himself, a steadiness, a center that held. They were together constantly through the worst of the war. And the bond that formed between them in the hedgerows and the frozen woods was the kind that only forms in places like that, and it did not break when the war ended. It was, for both of them, the great relationship of their lives. On the morning of D-Day, still scattered and short of men, Winters was ordered to take out a battery of German guns that were firing on the invasion beaches from an estate called Brécourt Manor. He had about a dozen men against a defended position, held by many times that number. What he did next became one of the most studied small unit actions in the history of the Army, calmly, methodically, using the ground and fire, and movement exactly the way it is supposed to be done, and almost never is under real fire. He took the guns, one by one, silenced the battery, and saved untold lives on the beach below, and he did it with a handful of paratroopers and almost no losses. The assault at Brécourt Manor is still taught at West Point. Winters rarely talked about it. To him it was simply the job, done right on the worst morning of many men's lives. That was who he was under fire, and Nixon was usually near him, the intelligence officer beside the combat leader, the two of them reading the battle together. Through Normandy, and then through the disastrous brave fighting in Holland in the autumn, Winters rose from company commander to battalion. Always the same calm centers, and Nixon rose with him on the staff, and the friendship deepened in the way that only shared danger deepens a thing. They had seen each other at the worst moments a man can be seen, and they had each decided the other was worth everything. And then came the winter, and Bastogne, which would test all of them past what they thought they could bear. In December of 1944, the Germans launched their last great offensive in the West, and the 101st Airborne was rushed to hold a crossroads town called Bastogne, surrounded, outnumbered, in the coldest winter anyone could remember, short of food and ammunition and warm clothing, shelled day and night in the frozen woods. It was, for easy company, the worst of the whole war. Men froze, men broke. Men died in the snow for a line on a map, and through it, Winters held the thing together the way he always had, by being steady when steadiness seemed impossible. And Nixon was there beside him, drinking more now, holding on by his fingernails, kept upright in part by his friend. The war did different things to different men, and it is worth being honest where he carried everything, quietly, inward, never letting the men see the weight. Nixon's carried it in a bottle, and the bottle was winning. Nixon carried it in a bottle, and the bottle was winning. By the end of the war, Nixon's drinking was no longer a young officer's excess. It was the thing running his life. He had been decorated, he had been brave, he had been brilliant at his job, and he was also coming, and the man who saw it most clearly and refused to look away was Dick Winters. And there was a moment near the end that says who Winters was. As the war closed and Easy Company took the surrender of exhausted, beaten German soldiers, Winters looked at the enemy in front of him and did not see monsters. He saw tired young men who had been fed into the same machine he had. On the other side of a line none of them had drawn, and he treated them with a decency that the war had given him every excuse to abandon. He had killed when he had to. He took no joy in it. He understood, better than most, that the men across from him were mostly just men, and that the whole thing was a tragedy wearing the costume of a triumph. He never lost that. It was the same clarity that would not let him give up on his friend. Because when the war ended, Nixon's real battle was just beginning. He came home to his knot-knee and his family and found that the war had unfitted him for the peace. His drinking deepened. His marriage failed. Then another. Families who had read the enemy so well could not read if Fortune slipped or could not stop it. The brilliant Yale man who had read the so well and his own decline or could not stop it until there was not much left, but the drinking and the wreckage fell around it. Here is where most stories end, with the war won and the men scattered to their fates. This one does not, because Dick Winters would not let it. He had a friend who was drowning, slowly, in plain sight, and Winters did the unglamorous, unfilmed, decades-long thing that real loyalty actually requires. He stayed. When Nixon hit bottom, Winters was there. When Nixon needed work, Winters, who had gone into business after the war, gave him a job and a reason to get up. He did not lecture him or abandon him or write him off as a lost cause, the way the world generally writes off a drunk. He simply refused, year after year, to stop being his friend. It was not quick, and it was not clean. Alcoholism rarely is. There were relapses and hard years, and times it must have looked hopeless. But slowly, with his third wife, and with the steady, stubborn presence of the friend who would not quit, Lewis Nixon climbed back. He got sober. He rebuilt a life. The last decades of his life were good ones, calmer, happier than anyone watching him in 1946 would have dared predict. He had been given something most men in his condition never get, a friend with the patience and the loyalty to wait out the worst of him and still be standing there when he came back. Nixon lived until 1995. Winters was his friend to the end. Winters, for his part, never sought anything for himself. Many believed he should have received the Medal of Honor for Brécourt Manor. He received the Distinguished Service Cross and never once complained about the difference. He went home to Pennsylvania, went into business, raised a family, and lived quietly, a modest man who happened to have been extraordinary. Late in life, when the world discovered his story and wanted to make him a hero all over again, he accepted it with the same steadiness he had shown at Brécourt, and he used the attention over and over to say the same thing, that the real heroes were the men who did not come home, and that leadership was mostly just caring about your people and doing the right thing when it was hard. He died in 2011, and the tributes called him a great soldier, which he was. But the truest thing about him was smaller and harder than that. The truest thing about Dick Winters is that he was the same man on the battlefield and off it. The decency that made him take those guns at Brécourt without losing his men is the same decency that made him refuse to send Nixon to the bottle. It was all one thing. He led the perfect assault, and he saved his broken friend out of the same steady, unshowy character, and if you understand that, you understand him completely. The war gave him a stage to be brave on. The 50 years, after it gave him something hard, a chance to be loyal when no one was filming, and he was. We remember the jump and the guns and the frozen woods, because those are the parts that look like a war story. But the two men themselves knew what the real story was. It was not the perfect assault. It was the friendship, the one that formed between the sober farm boy and the brilliant drunk in the worst place on earth. And that held, against every reason it should not have, for the rest of their lives. Winters saved a lot of men's lives in the war with his skill. He saved one man's life after it with his loyalty, one slow decade at a time, and that may have been the harder thing, and the better one. So that is the story underneath the famous one. Not a company of heroes, though they were that. Two men, as different as two men can be, who found in each other the thing each of them lacked, and who never let go. The war ended in 1945. The friendship ended in 1995, when Nixon died, and not before. And when people asked Dick Winters near the end of his own long life whether he considered himself a hero, he always said the same thing, that he was not, that he had just tried to be a good man and take care of the people around him. He said it about the war, but it was the whole story of his life, and the best part of it was the part no camera ever caught, the part where he stood by the one friend the world had given up on, and would not give up to. That is what the record forgets, and what the men remembered. Not the battle. The loyalty,